nanohub.org.
Online simulation and more for nanotechnology.
All right, so good afternoon. So today we'll have the second session with Professor Melloch on Enhance Your Learning, on research on how to learn. And go ahead.
Thank you, Garrett. Okay, so let's start by recalling what we did last time. And remember, recall is an important learning process. Okay, so we talked about spaced instead of block learning. Remember those forgetting curves of Ebbinghaus? You know, you spend a lot of time learning something and you have this rapid decay. It's better to spread out the time over several days, continually reinforcing, not putting in any more time, but spreading it out, and you greatly slow the decay. The other thing we learned was you want to interleave the topics you're studying or the subjects. The interleaving tends to make things seem a little bit harder, but you build more connections and you get better at recognizing what mental models are the appropriate ones to pull out of memory. You want to study in different settings. If you only study in one setting, then you have a lot of cues from that room, and you could take a test in that room and perform very well, but you won't perform as well when you go into a different room and take a test. So you want to go to many different settings when you study, so that maybe you don't have such a dependence on the cues from that room, or you have many more cues to call on. We talked about preparation and incubation. Preparation is that focused, conscious studying. Incubation is what happens afterwards. You're trying to learn something, you're having difficulty with it, or you're trying to solve a problem, you're having difficulty with it. When you go away, your subconscious mind keeps working on that problem. And when you go back to look at it again, it might come to you at that point because of the incubation that has gone on. Deliberate practice. Okay, so that's where you're not just studying to memorize things, you're studying to really understand. You're doing things like testing yourself and taking tests, working problems, and you're not looking at solutions. That's a naive way to practice. If you can't solve a problem, you just let it sit. Let some incubation occur, come back and look at it again and again. Explain things out loud. When you're verbalizing, elaborating things, you're forming additional connections, and that helps the learning process. You want to bring all senses to bear. You know, you don't want to just be a visual learner, auditory. You want to use vision, your hearing, your sense of touch. Writing turns out to be an important part of the learning process. Okay, so last time we looked at a couple puzzles that I said would take some incubation probably to solve. Okay, the first one was to move 3 dimes so you form a triangle pointing down. Okay, I could not solve this. And so I put it away, so incubation was occurring. I actually woke up, and this is the solution I had when I woke up. Move 3 dimes. It didn't say you had to use them all. That's not what they were looking for, but that's what I came up with. So the actual solution in the book I was looking at was these 3 dimes get moved, these 2 up and this one down. Okay, this is an easy one, probably. This equation contains 3 errors. So you can spot the 2 spelling errors, but the third error is that the equation is in error. I mean, the sentence is an error. Right? Okay, so this one, you had to draw 4 lines that connect all the dots. Okay, you look at that, and the dots are constraining you. Okay, you have to think outside the dots. Okay. So let me give you another one. You have 6 pencils of equal length, and you're to form 4 equilateral triangles. I'll give you a slight hint. think out, like you did here, think outside the dots. You're going to have to think outside a little to get this one. Okay, so today we're going to talk about sleep, mindset, grit and self-discipline, exercise, meditation, and nutrition. Now, last time we mentioned how the brain uses 20% of your body's energy. So that's why some of these topics are going to be discussed today. So let's talk about sleep first. Okay, what determines when you sleep? Oh, there's two things. You have a suprachiasmatic nucleus. That's a part of your brain that determines that 24-hour cycle, your circadian cycle. And it does that by a chemical messenger called melatonin. It turns out our rhythm is actually a little longer than 24 hours. Nathaniel Kleitman, who was an early researcher on sleep at the University of Chicago, he made one of his graduate students go with him in a mammoth cave for 6 weeks in the total darkness. And they kept track of their sleep and wake times. The graduate student had like a 26-hour cycle. Kleitman had like a 24-and-a-half-hour cycle. But everyone has typically a little longer than a 24-hour cycle. Sunlight, when you eat dinner, those things kind of reset you a little bit every day to keep you on the 24 hours. Adenosine is the second part. This is a chemical that builds up while you're sleeping. It's kind of like a clock. You can tell how long someone's been up by how much of this adenosine they have. It causes what they call sleep pressure. Okay, so first thing I want to tell you is that not getting enough sleep is really bad for you. In fact, it can kill you. Okay? Some processes are slow, some are more immediate. They don't allow them to do this anymore, but they've done experiments on animals where they've kept them up and they eventually die. And when they do autopsies, they see degradation of the nerves in the brain and in the spinal column. There's a disease, fortunately it's very rare, and it's hereditary, called familiar or fatal familiar insomnia. And when people get this, something goes wrong with their thalamus, which is a part of the brain that kind of shuts off the outside world so they can't go to sleep anymore. And diagnosed with this, there's nothing they can do for you. So it's so bad even that the Guinness Book of World Records does not accept sleep deprivation records anymore. Okay, so we're going to talk about the effects of lack of sleep on functioning when you're awake. And this is something that will be probably quite familiar to you, but maybe something that isn't is what goes on when you're sleeping. It turns out all through the night, all through your different sleep cycles, things are going on that affect your learning. Okay, so the first thing that sleep does is it affects your memory inbox. Remember last time we talked about patient HM and he had his hippocampus removed to alleviate his epilepsy, and he couldn't put things in long-term memory anymore. It turns out during the day, you accumulate things in your hippocampus, and it's at night they're moved to a long-term storage regions of your brain. Lack of sleep hurts you during the day putting things into your hippocampus. Lack of sleep will affect your concentration. You've probably, had days where you had to get up early and know how it's affected your concentration. And it also causes something called microsleeps, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Your immune system is impaired. They've done studies where there's a direct correlation between increase in lack of sleep and infection rates. They would expose people to viruses, after they've gone so many nights with 8 hours of sleep, so many nights with 7 hours of sleep, 6 hours, and so forth. And the less sleep, the greater the infection rates. So that will hurt your learning. If you get sick, you're not going to want to go to class, you're not going to want to study. Emotional problems. You know, people who don't sleep are cranky, right? When they put people in an MRI who haven't been sleeping, the amygdala is very active. The amygdala is a part of the brain that's involved in responses to things like fear and anger and rage. Okay, 20% of your body energy is used in the brain. You know, when you're using energy, what happens? There's byproducts, right? Contaminants. It's during the sleep that you're there's a system in your brain, I forget the name of it now, that clears out all these contaminants. Okay, and for instance, one of the contaminants is amyloid proteins. And when they do biopsies on people who've died from Alzheimer's, there's a lot of amyloid proteins in their brain. Lack of sleep increases cortisol. That's the stress hormone, the fight or flight. So having that in your system is causing stress, which isn't good. It'll cause things to happen like an increased risk of type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, stroke, depression, and anxiety. Okay, so we know for when you're awake, it's not a good thing that you're lacking some sleep. And let me just mention these microsleeps. These are brief periods when you're blind to the outside world and you don't even know it. Okay? So this is how one study on microsleeps. Okay, they have, you look at a screen and a light flashes, and every time a light flashes, you push the button. So they did this with the subjects for 2 weeks. So every day they would do that. So the people who were getting 8 hours of sleep never missed a flash. As the sleep decreased, there was an increase in the number of flashes missed. And the subject said, I saw them all, I didn't miss any of them. And it turns out that 10 days of 6 hours sleep, you're missing as many flashes as someone who hasn't slept for 24 hours. Okay, so Nathaniel Kleitman, with one of his graduate students, was doing further studies. They were looking at infants and infant eye movements. So one of the things they noticed was when the infants were asleep, their eyes were moving rapidly. So they called that rapid eye movement sleep or REM sleep. Okay, so they were also monitoring the brain activity, the electrical activity in the brain, and based on that electric activity, they identified, besides the REM sleep, additional non-REM sleep stages. And what they found was people have about a 90-minute cycle. You go into a deep non-REM sleep, come out into REM. Deep non-REM, back into REM, and so forth. And the amount of REM sleep as the night goes on increases compared to the non-REM sleep. And here's what those different stages look like. So the top one is awake, the bottom one is during REM sleep. This one you can see a difference, but often you could look at these scans for someone who is awake and in REM sleep, and it's hard to tell a difference. And sometimes REM sleep has more activity than the awake sleep. Stage 1, non-REM sleep, the signals have frequency components from 8 to 13 hertz. Stage 2, 4 to 7 hertz. Stage 3 and 4, less than 4 hertz. The other thing, in these real slow frequency deep sleeps, the neurons seem to all be firing in sync, so you get very large voltages. The other thing you see during stage 2 non-REM sleep are these things called sleep spindles. These are brief bursts of a few seconds of higher frequencies. Okay, and it's not surprising that such complicated things going on in sleep must have a purpose. And a lot of that purpose is in learning. Okay, so the first one is that during deep non-REM sleep, information you've picked up during the day that's in your hippocampus gets transferred to the neocortex. Okay, so you take someone and have them study something, you put them in the MRI and have them go over it again, their hippocampus is lighting up. Then you let them go away, go home, sleep, come back the next day, they go over that material again, the hippocampus is quiet. It's the neocortex that's lighting up. So the information has been transferred from the hippocampus to the neocortex. In addition, when they monitor the sleep and measure how much deep non-REM sleep someone's getting, the researchers can tell this person's going to get 80%, we call 80% of the material, this one 50%. It correlates with how much deep non-REM sleep you are obtaining. Now, the process of moving information from the hippocampus to the neocortex isn't what erases the hippocampus. And you have to erase the hippocampus to make it ready to have space for learning the next day. So what they do is they can measure how much capacity someone has the next day to learn new material. And what they find, it correlates with how many sleep spindles they had the night before. So it's the sleep spindle period that is erasing the hippocampus and getting it ready to receive new information the next day. Now, the other thing is you don't remember everything, right? There are things you don't want to remember. So you actually cue things that are important to remember, so you remember them and forget other things. Okay, so they did this experiment where, let's say someone memorizes a list of words. So they have it memorized, they can repeat it. But next to each word, they had a letter with R, indicating it's something they needed to remember long term, F, something they should forget. So the next day, there was a big discrepancy. They remembered a lot more words that had the R next to them than the F. And the discrepancy increased with the number of sleep spindles the night before. Okay, so when I tell my class, so here's something interesting, but it's not going to be on the test, sleep spindle's going to erase that, right? During REM sleep, a lot of the relationships between, different things you've learned, say that day you learn something and now in your REM sleep, you make connections to things you've learned in the past. It's a time you've been working on a problem. You can bring your mind looks at the different things you have in your brain and figures out which things pertain to that particular problem. So a very good time for incubation is during REM sleep. And also a lot of creativity happens during the REM stages of sleep. So here's a study they did where they took rats and they put electrodes in their brain so they could monitor their electrical activity. And they had the rats learning a maze. And the researcher could watch a monitor and watch the signals coming from those electrodes and tell where in the maze the rat was. Then when the rats were sleeping, they could see the rats were running the maze in their sleep. So they were reinforcing what was happening during the day. Okay, so here's a study where they took 102 undergraduates who had never taken an econ course. And they were split into two groups. One group watched a virtual lecture in the morning, and then in the evening, 12 hours later, took an exam. The second group watched the virtual lecture in the evening, and then 12 hours later in the morning after a full night of rest took an exam. So on problems that was like a simple recall of things that were in the lecture, the ones who slept did 8 percentage points better than the ones who stayed awake. So it was an improvement. But the big improvements were in novel problems, where the students had to take maybe 2 different things from different parts of the lecture and bring them together to be able to solve a problem. And those more novel problems, the sleep group did 32 percentage points better than the wake group. Okay, so here's another example. So these subjects were taught how to solve a mathematical problem using a very long, tedious method. What they didn't tell them was there was a very simple way to do it. So group 1 studied in the morning and stayed awake, and group 2 studied in the evening and slept. And then they came back to work some more problems. The group that did not sleep, only 23% of them figured out that simple solution. Of the group that slept, almost 60% figured out that simple solution. So at night, their brain looked at this problem and figured out the simpler way to do it. Another way to show that REM sleep is important for this process is with the use of alcohol. Turns out alcohol is the best known suppressor of REM sleep. Okay, so it's popular to use this artificial grammar in these studies. So they teach people this artificial grammar to where they get to a 90% proficiency. And then a week later, they're going to be tested. Okay, so group 1 consumed no alcohol for that week, had their regular 8 hours a night of sleep. Group 2 had 2 or 3 shots of vodka the night they learned this artificial grammar, depending on their weight. Then no more alcohol for the rest of the week and normal sleep. Group 3 consumed 2 or 3 shots, but on the 3rd night. And they all slept regularly for the full week. Group 1, who consumed no alcohol, retained their 90% proficiency, and in fact, they had an enhancement of their ability to use this artificial grammar. The ones who had the 2 or 3 shots of vodka that night scored a 50% efficiency. Okay, so if you've been putting a lot of time in studying and your friends come over and say, let's go out and have a couple beers or something, you know you're going to be throwing away a lot of the studying you've just done. But also, if you don't have that alcohol for 2 or 3 days, it still affects how well your brain is still processing for several nights. So it will still hurt your learning. Here was a study where they looked at people studying things in the morning, and they were looking at all different subjects: words, pattern recognition games, straight retention, comprehension of deeper structures and all. And what they found is then the group that had an hour-long nap before being tested did about 30% better than those in the study who did not have that nap. Okay, so this study shows again the importance of REM sleep where dreaming occurs. So they had 100 participants who were studying a virtual maze. So then you try to learn the maze and run through it on your computer. Okay, then they took half of them had a 90-minute nap and the other half just stayed awake. Okay, so what they did was 3 times during that 90-minute period, they asked them what they were thinking about. So the wake group, that meant every 30 minutes, what are you thinking about right now? With the sleep group, they woke them and asked them, were you dreaming? What were you dreaming about? For the ones who stayed awake, when they were queried, if they didn't mention something about the maze, they did about as well when they were retested running the maze. When they were queried, if they said something related to the maze, it turns out they were faster by about 50 seconds doing the maze when they came back to it. Okay, so that goes back to what we've learned about, recalling. The act of recalling things is going to help your learning. Now, the ones who were asleep, when they woke them and they were dreaming about something not related to the maze, they maybe did a little bit better. But the fascinating thing is the ones they woke up and said, oh, I was thinking about this related to the maze, they improved their times by over 5 minutes. Okay, so that dreaming was greatly enhancing their understanding of that virtual maze they had been studying when they were awake. Okay, Matthew Walker gave a talk in 2000 to a general audience. And after the talk, a man came up and said, I'm a pianist, and I'll be learning a new piece, and there will be a section in there that I just can't get. He goes, but when I come back the next day and sit down, I can play it with no effort. And he was asking Matthew if that had something to do with the sleep. And Matthew Walker said, well, I don't know of any study like that yet. So he went off and did it. So he had people learn a sequence of keystrokes. If they were right-handed, they had them do it with their left hand. So the computer could keep track of how fast they can do it and how accurately. Okay, and then after they had slept, they came back and he retested them. And he found that they were 20% faster and 35% more efficient. So your brain, while you're sleeping, is working to solidify those skills you were practicing during the day. Okay, if I haven't convinced you yet how important sleep is and how you should be getting 8 hours of sleep every night, let me show you one more study was done at the University of Sweden. Okay, so they took subjects, and after 8 hours of sleep, they took a picture of them. Then the next night, they had them sleep for 5 hours, and they took a picture. And they took the picture at the same time of day, under the same lighting, same conditions, and everything. Then they had observers go through a bunch of pictures and rate the attractiveness of the photographs. So this guy would have had his 2 photographs, there may have been 100 pictures, one at position 25 and one at 65. Consistently, the observers ranked the picture that corresponded to 8 hours of sleep much more attractive. Okay, so let's move on and talk about mindsets. Okay, if you watched the football game where Drew Brees broke the career passing yardage record, they stopped the game, he went to the sidelines, and he kneeled down to his kids and said, you can accomplish anything in life if you are willing to work for it. Okay, and then they asked him, I watched an interview after the game, and they asked him, why did you think of saying that to your kids? He goes, I say that to them every day. Drew has a growth mindset, and he's trying to instill a growth mindset in his kids. Here's a Kelvin and Hobbes cartoon where Kelvin comes up to Susie and asks her what she is doing. She said, I was having trouble with the homework, and she explains all the things she was doing to learn the material, to be able to do the homework. And Kelvin goes, you do all that work? And she goes, well, now I understand it. And he goes, I used to think you were smart. So Carol Dweck is a researcher at Stanford, and she refers to these as a fixed mindset and growth mindset. Kelvin has a fixed mindset. Susie has a growth mindset. So with the fixed mindset, people think that your efforts don't matter. You either have the skill or talent to do something. Whereas a growth mindset person knows people differ in talent, but with effort, everyone can grow and get better at something. Fixed mindset people are concerned with proving things, proving they are smart, they did well on an exam. Growth mindset people are concerned with improving. For fixed mindset, if you fail at something, it means you're not smart. For the growth mindset, it means you're learning. Success begins with failure. Think back if you learned how to ride a bike. You failed a lot, you fell a lot. But each fall, your brain learned a little bit more about being able to balance. Fixed mindset people will self-handicap. They won't go into a difficult program of study because they don't want to be proven that they're not smart. They may not take a course because they've heard it's a difficult course. Or they'll stay up partying and then they have an excuse. I hadn't recovered when I went in to take the test. Growth mindset people believe true potential is unknown and it takes time to flower. Okay, so this answer to this question will kind of tell if you are a growth or fixed mindset person. Do you believe your intelligence is fixed or something you could develop? It turns out that performance on intelligence quizzes have actually gone up 15 points over the last 50 years. An IQ test is written so the average is a 100. Okay, so every year they put together new IQ tests, and they didn't notice that they were actually, because it was such a small increment every year, that they were making them harder and harder. But James Flynn discovered that if someone takes an IQ test today and gets 100 on it, and then he gave them an IQ test from 50 years ago, they would score 115. That's a standard deviation. So IQs, or whatever an intelligence test measures, has been going up. Turns out the brain is remarkably plastic. It's now known it can grow at any age. Neurons are born in the hippocampus every day. The dendrites are growing and sprouting. You're forming connections. You're forming new blood vessels. As you're listening to me, things are changing in your brain. In fact, MRI studies can tell a difference in just 2 hours when someone spends 2 hours really concentrating on something. Now, the neurogenesis in the adult mammal brain was discovered by Joseph Altman in the 60s. And back then it was such dogma that he was either ignored or ridiculed, and he didn't get tenure at MIT. He then actually came to Purdue and spent the rest of his career on the faculty in the biology department here. But in the late 1990s, neurogenesis was rediscovered and Altman was proven correct. So let's look at some studies. So this one, they took some adolescents and measured their IQ. So they got an IQ score for their math ability, for their English ability. They also did MRI brain scans. Then they came back and tested them 4 years later. Some students scored higher on the math IQ test. Some scored higher on the English IQ portion. So their IQs did change. And when they did MRI scans, the ones who improved their math, the regions of the brain associated with doing math had strengthened, and the same thing for those who improved their English. So MRI is based on nuclear magnetic resonance. And Edward Purcell received the Nobel Prize in 1952 for discovering nuclear magnetic resonance. He was a BSEE here at Purdue. Okay, another study. London taxi drivers. They have to know an area that has a 6-mile radius. There's 25,000 streets. London is not in a grid. It's a mess. To get a license, they also have to know the most efficient route between any 2 points. The Thames River cuts through. To complicate things, they must know where every landmark is. And the test they have to take is called the knowledge. And it typically takes 4 years of study. So in this research, they took MRI scans of people who were going to study to become London taxi cab drivers. What they found is that those who passed the test, their hippocampi were noticeably larger. So it's like weightlifting, building strength. They built the strength of their hippocampus with all the studying they did. It's also known that regions of the brain can be annexed for different purposes. For instance, if someone goes blind, then the visual regions of the brain get annexed for other purposes. For instance, as they learn Braille, their sense of touch increases because more parts of their brain, mainly coming from the visual cortex, are now utilized to read Braille. Okay, so my point here was to convince you that the brain can really change if you work at it. Okay, so here was a study that Carol Dweck did at Columbia University with students taking a Premed Chemistry class. So she interviewed them to determine if they were growth or fixed mindset people, by asking them questions like, do you believe your intelligence is fixed or something you can develop? She found those she put in the fixed mindset category did poorly in the class. They reread the text and notes, and they tried to memorize things, which we know is not a deliberate practice technique. The growth mindset earned better grades. They looked for themes and underlying principles. So they were studying to actually learn the material and not worrying about acing a test. And the acing of the test came naturally then. Now you can very easily put someone in a growth or fixed mindset. Okay, so this study, they had a diverse group of 5th graders and they gave them 10 math questions from an IQ test. And the average number correct was 5. Then they split them into 3 groups. So in one group, they went to each child and said, okay, you got 5 right. This was a real hard set of questions. You must be really intelligent. I'll put them in a fixed mindset. The next group, they told them, you got 5 right. These were hard. You must have put in a lot of effort and worked hard to get those 5 right. And the third group, they gave non-specific praise, like, I like your sneakers. Okay. So those with non-specific praise performed missed a step. Then they gave them a set of very hard questions, where they got maybe a couple right. And then they went back to give them set of 10 questions that had the same difficulty as the original 10. So in that set, those who got non-specific praise got about the same 5 right. Those who were praised for intelligence actually lowered their math IQ a little bit. They went from 5 to about 4.4. Those who were praised for effort went from 5 to 6.81. Great increase in their math IQ. by putting them in a growth mindset. One more thing they did with these children. They told them that they were going to go and do these questions at another school, asked them to write a brief paragraph describing what it was like for these other children to see. And oh, by the way, indicate what score you received. The ones who they put in a fixed mindset, 40% of them lied about their score, and always in one direction. So by praising the kids for their intelligence, they turned them into liars. Okay, so here's another one where 7th graders, students entering 7th grade, one group had 6 sessions on study skills. The other group had some sessions on study skills, but some talking about how plastic the brain is and growth mindset and how you can improve your intelligence with work. So out of 6th grade, these students, both groups had an average GPA of about 2.5. In 7th grade, the ones who were just taught study skills, their math GPAs dropped from like 2.5 to 2.37. Those who were taught about the brain being plastic and that with a growth mindset you can improve your intelligence, their math GPA went up to 2.68. So a 0.3 of a point difference by moving someone into a growth mindset. Have you ever seen the movie Groundhog Day? Okay, so Bill Murray plays Phil Connor. He's a weatherman at a Pittsburgh TV station. He's a very fixed mindset person. And they make him go to this small town to cover the groundhog ceremony. Okay, so on March 2nd at this small town, they pull out this groundhog. If it sees its shadow, 6 more days of winter, or 6 more weeks of winter. If it doesn't see its shadow, there's going to be an early spring. Phil Connor has complete contempt for having this little town, this ceremony, and the people there. He can't wait to get out of this town. As they're leaving, a big snowstorm comes. He's stuck there. Okay, so next day comes around, his alarm goes off. It's Groundhog Day again. And this keeps repeating. And so he starts to play out his fixed mindset. He learns about people so he can impress them the next day or ridicule them. Then he eventually gets tired of that and he can't take it anymore, so he tries to kill himself. He gets run over by a car. Then he wakes up, it's Groundhog Day again. He electrocutes himself. Wakes up, it's Groundhog Day again. Jumps off a building. Wakes up, it's Groundhog Day again. So he finally decides he was going to start using the days for something else. He starts to take piano lessons. He gets very good at playing the piano. He learns a foreign language. He reads voraciously. He starts to learn about the people in the town and help them. So he transforms from fixed to growth mindset, and then the spell breaks, and he wakes up, and it's the day after Groundhog Day. Here's an example of someone with a growth mindset. This was a person who wanted to be a writer. He earned a C- in high school English. His SAT verbal score was a 475 out of 800. That put him in the bottom third. He needed 5 years to graduate high school. He read much slower than the average person, and he had difficulty spelling. But he wanted to be a writer, and he just kept at it. That person is John Irving, who has written 17 novels. His book, The World According to Garp, won the National Book Award, was made into a movie. His book, The Cider House Rules, was made into a movie, and he got an Academy Award for writing the screenplay for that movie. Okay, so now let's move on and talk about self-control and grit. So never put off till tomorrow what you can do the day after tomorrow. Okay, we've all been guilty of that, right? Procrastination. Okay, so here's a study done at Stanford in 1970. They took preschoolers and they put them in the room. So they sat at a table and there was a marshmallow in front of them. And the researcher told the children that you can eat that marshmallow at any time. But if you can keep from eating it for 15 minutes, we'll give you 2 marshmallows. Well, a couple children didn't even listen to all the instructions. As soon as they heard you can eat the marshmallow anytime, they ate it. Okay. So when the researcher left the room, the purpose was to see what the children would do. You know, some of them would do this and try not to look at the marshmallow or cover their eyes or sit on their hands. About 1/3 of the 600 children were able to wait 15 minutes and get their second marshmallow. Well, when these children were seniors, they thought about following up and seeing how they were doing. And what they found was there was a direct correlation with how well they did in high school and how long they could wait for that second marshmallow. And then there was another follow-up study the first follow-up study was in '89, and then in 2011, they looked at those children again and saw that the longer they could wait, the much more successful careers they had had. Now, this study has been criticized a lot because it had a small sample size. It wasn't a very diverse population because it was a Stanford preschool, and so it was all children of faculty members and graduate students. But it's not hard to imagine that tonight, if you have something to study and your friend comes by and says, let's go out, if you can resist that temptation and stay and study, that you're going to be more successful. In this study, they looked at how much time students actually study. So back in '61, college students were spending 24 hours a week working outside of their classes. By 2003, it had reduced to 14 hours. They've also did this study where they took 263 students and told them to spend just 15 minutes studying something important that they had to do. And then every minute they would observe what the students were actually doing. It turned out at about 2 minutes, things started to decline. They started to, check their phone, check their email, and it turned out that they could only spend 65% of that 15 minutes concentrating on one thing. Okay, that's why we'll eventually talk about meditation, because that's something that could help you here. They also watched classes and observed what the students were doing in the classes. And they, for each person, were able to determine how much time people were spending on Facebook or texting rather than paying attention to what was going on in the class. And then when they checked the students' grade point averages, there was a direct correlation. The more time spent doing these texting, Facebook, the lower the GPA of the students. So maybe the new marshmallow test of self-discipline is the ability to resist a blinking inbox or a buzzing phone. Okay, something kind of related to this is something known as grit. Okay, and this is actually a psychological term. It stands for passion and perseverance for long-term goals. Okay, so passion means you love what you're doing. Now, it's rare, but occasionally you'll encounter something and go, oh, this is great, I'm going to do this for the rest of my life. But usually passions have to be developed. And having a passion and then being able to pursue it for year after year is what grit is. And Angela Duck, okay, so the self-control is the ability to resist those hourly temptations. The grit is more long-term. It's that ability to pursue something that's challenging for months, years, maybe even decades. And both are important things to have. Now, Angela Duckworth, who's a professor of psychology at University of Pennsylvania, explains it this way. She said, everyone has a different amount of talent, but you can put in effort. If you have less talent, you have to put in a little more effort to get to the same skill level. But then to really achieve something, you have to take that skill and apply effort to make that achievement. So effort gets squared in the equation where talent only enters once. So effort is a much more important to what you achieve than your starting talent. Okay, so this study here ties together a lot of what we've talked about last time and this time. And it's a study by Anders Ericsson, who you recall from last time we talked about the concept of deliberate practice. So he went to the Berlin University of the Arts, and he asked the faculty there to identify the violin students into 3 categories. One category was the best. These were students they thought might become international soloists. The good ones were ones they thought would become members of some city orchestra somewhere. And then the ones they thought their careers would be teaching little kids violin for the rest of their lives. Okay? Now, these were all serious violin students, so they've been doing deliberate practice a long time. They've been keeping track of their practices. So he looked at the amount of time they spent practicing versus their age. And if any age, the ones in the best category had practiced more than the ones in the good category, who practiced more than the ones in the teacher category. So at least for this group of students, talent wasn't the differentiator. It was the amount of time they put in with deliberate practice. Okay? And if you look at age 20, the ones who could be international soloists had hit 10,000 hours of practice. The ones who might be in a city orchestra, about 8,000. The teachers, 4,000 to 5,000. You might have heard this rule that they say it takes 10,000 hours to become an expert. This is the study that kind of came from. But Anders Ericsson has clarified later that it's not 10,000 hours of practice. If you keep doing the same thing over and over again, you're not going to get better. You don't get better playing the violin by just playing music all the time. You do scales, all sort, fingering, working on different ways of running the bow across. So you have to do many hours of deliberate study. The other thing he looked at how they slept. And if you look at this, you see those in the best category slept more than the good students, and the good students slept more than the teachers. So we already know that helps you in developing your skills. Plus, look at the ones in that best category actually did a lot of napping too. Okay, so people with a growth mindset tend to be grittier. And that's because if you have a growth mindset, you know with the effort you can achieve something. So it makes it a lot easier to keep working at something. So grit and the self-discipline, those are things that can be acquired. They're psychological traits. You know, psychological traits are typically like 20 to 35% inherited, but the rest come from your environment, your development of them. You know, culture can instill them. Being around gritty people can make you gritty. So when you make friends, try to make friends with people who are displaying good self-discipline and are gritty. Thinking of yourself as gritty can lead to being gritty. If you decide, I'm going to practice at being gritty, eventually you will become gritty. Fake it till you make it. Turns out if someone can engage in an extracurricular activity for at least 2 years, and even better if they achieve something in that, like if they're in student government and become an officer, or in debate team and win some competition, or chess club and win some competition, that's even better. That means you're displaying grit, you've acquired grit. And in fact, when they look at students' performance in college, once you account for grades and SAT scores, the best thing to determine how successful someone is if they spent at least 2 years on a single extracurricular activity in high school. Make a list of tasks for tomorrow. Okay, it turns out that humans, when they commit to something, they have this unconscious psychological drive to fulfill that commitment. So writing things down causes that commitment. I'll talk about meditating, but that's a way to help improve your self-discipline. Put routines in place. Okay, so you have 2 hours between classes on Monday, Wednesday, and Fridays. Make it a routine that you always go to the library for those 2 hours and study. Then let's say Tuesdays and Thursdays, you have an hour between classes. Go to this coffee shop, have a coffee and study. Have a set routine that you do something the same week after week, and that will help promote these new habits. Okay, it often takes about 3 months to acquire these new habits of self-discipline and grit. The Pomodoro technique is another kind of way to force a routine. Okay, so Frank Cirillo, who came up with this, he had a kitchen timer in the shape of a tomato. Tomato in Italian is pomodoro, so that's why he called it the Pomodoro technique. So you decide you have a task. You set the timer at 25 minutes, you turn off your cell phone, shut down your email, and try to stay on task for that 25 minutes. Timer goes off, you take a break. Take 5 minutes to go for a walk, get a cup of coffee, whatever. Gives you a little bit of incubation time. Then you can come back and do it again. If you can get up to where you're doing several of these, take a longer break then. Give yourself a longer incubation period. Okay, so let's talk about exercise next. Okay, exercise improves your circulation. And remember, your brain uses 20% of your energy. That glucose and oxygen gets through your brain, through your circulatory system. So that's one aspect of exercise that's important. And it's been found exercise spurs production of neurotransmitters. It helps the plasticity, this formation of dendrites and synapses. It boosts something called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF. And this stuff is referred to as brain fertilizer. I mentioned how neurons get born in the hippocampus every day. They don't survive unless there's enough BDNF in your brain. So here was a study at the University of Dublin. They took some students who don't exercise, and they got them to commit to a 5-week program of strenuous exercise on a stationary bike. And they did MRIs before and after this exercise program. So you can visually see the effect of the exercise on the hippocampus. Greatly increased in size with the exercise, which was providing that BDNF, which was nourishing those new neurons that were being generated. Okay, so in this study, they looked at 59 adults in the 60 to 79 year age group and split them into two. One group did aerobic exercises for 6 months, and the other group just did stretching and toning exercises. And they did brain MRI before and after. And again, they saw that those who were going through the aerobic routines had a much more gray and white matter in the frontal and temporal lobes of their brains. So again, exercise was improving the brain. Okay, so let's talk about meditation. You can think of this as strength training for your brain. Now there's many types, but I'm talking about just doing something simple. You just sit in a comfortable chair, do it for 10 minutes, you close your eyes, and you take slow, deep abdominal breaths. And you try to just think of the air and your breathing, the air going in and out. What it does, it's going to relieve stress, it's going to heighten awareness, it's going to enhance your concentration, and it's going to help you to ignore that mental chatter that distracts you that's going on in your brain. Now, if you've never meditated, what you'll find is when you start and try to do this, you probably won't even get a minute before you're thinking of something. And then you realize, well, I'm not thinking of the breath going in and out, I'm thinking of something else. So then you redirect yourself and refocus on just your breath. And that's part of the process, that realizing you've lost your concentration on your breath and you're bringing it back. And meditation causes visual changes in the brain. So this study at Harvard took 16 adults, and they had weekly classes on meditation. Okay, and they were doing a lot of meditation, but this was only over an 8-week period. So they averaged 3 hours a week meditating for 8 weeks. The MRI scans showed there was an increase in gray matter around the hippocampus and decrease in gray matter around the amygdala. Now the amygdala is, as I mentioned earlier, involved in emotional responses like fear, anger, and rage. Okay, this study at UCLA, they wanted to look at people who'd been meditating a long time, for 10, 20, 30 years. So UCLA and Los Angeles, they could probably find plenty of people who have been meditating for a long time. But what they found is those who had been meditating for decades, there was definitely had slowed the age-related loss of gray matter. They had a lot more girification, folding of their cortex, which is also associated with brain processing ability. And here was a study at the University of Pennsylvania's medical school. And they saw people who were meditators have significantly higher blood flow to the prefrontal cortex, parietal cortex, and other areas of the brain that are involved in things like attention, regulation of emotion, and so forth. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about nutrition. Okay, so you think about athletes, you know that they worry about nutrition, right? Well, 20% of the energy is going to your brain. You know, nutrition is important for your mental processes also. Okay, some foods cause inflammation, okay? Now, inflammation is good if you have an injury or an infection and your body is fighting it. But some foods just cause inflammation even though you don't have a need for the inflammation. And inflammation will do things like kill nerves. Sugar and high fructose corn syrup, sugars are toxins. Okay? They cause inflammation all over your body. Okay, here at the University of California at San Francisco Medical School, they found that too much high fructose corn syrup can damage your liver just like alcohol does. They also found that Alzheimer's disease, cognitive decline, and memory loss linked to excess sugar consumption. So cutting down or eliminating sugar will probably keep you from getting type 2 diabetes, probably keep you from getting dementia. And you probably all know already trans fats are bad, excess alcohol is bad, processed foods are bad because they contain these bad oils and fats and sugars and things. In fact, 80% of foods in U.S. groceries have had sugar added to them. If you look on labels, you'll see sugar added, fiber removed. Bad things for you. Good things for shelf life for the food. So, things you want to eat are, stay away from those processed foods. Shop on the outside of the grocery. You want omega-3 fatty acids, which are found in wild-caught fish, not farm fish, grass-fed beef, not corn-fed beef. Get good oils and fats, like from olive oil, avocados, almonds. And here's just a few other good foods. Same thing, pasteurized raised eggs, so the chickens are actually eating insects and grains and not, or seeds instead of being force-fed grains. Okay, so let's kind of summarize everything. Okay, so we've already did this summary, this recall at the beginning of class, and my throat's starting to go, so I think I'll just skip to the things we talked about today. Okay, so we talked about developing a growth mindset, grit, and self-control. So you know that you can get better at anything you want to get better at. Okay? You just have to discipline yourself to work at it. So you want to develop good study habits and reduce your habits of procrastination. So put in routines, do mindfulness meditation, make lists of things that you want to accomplish the next day so you have this commitment to doing something. We saw the importance of sleep and how all the stages of sleep are important for the learning process. Exercise is good for your brain. Your brain will grow with exercise. Healthy diet is important. And I'll leave you with this page, which is several books. And everything I've talked about in these 2 sessions are contained in one or more of these books. So I can highly recommend any of them. And if you see a particular aspect of what we're doing, get a hold of one of these books and read more about it. So I think I'll stop at this point. We only have like 5 minutes left, and see if there are any questions. Okay, well, thank you for your attention, and have a good evening.